So there are a couple of points about historic brick making. Bricks, by their nature, are simple. Making bricks is very simple to do. It's very easy. It doesn't take a lot of complicated schooling. It doesn't take, as we explain in the brick making in the brickyard, it doesn't take an apprenticeship 5, 6, 7 years of specialized training to learn how to make a brick. Everybody here probably knows how to make a brick. It's just made out of clay, it's shaped in a mold, it's dried and it's fired. That's about as simple as it needs. Everything that you would need to make the bricks here at Salubria is here at Salubria. And we're gonna go sort of step by step what that entails. The first thing you're gonna need is clay. Well, if you're from Virginia or know anything about the East Coast, it's very hard to find clay. No, I'm just kidding. Right. It's right there. I went out before everybody got here this morning. I got here a little early, went out there into the pasture and dug a hole and have a bucket of clay. It's that easy to find. It's not complicated. As we like to say in the brickyard, it's not rocket science. It's brick science. It's pretty simple stuff. Clay can vary. If you work, say, in one part of Virginia, like I do down in the Tidewater area, Williamsburg, the Peninsula area, you have one thing up here that we don't really have to worry about, and that's rocks. I mean, just in my hand right now, squeaking, you can feel pebbles, you can feel shards of rock, probably chunks of iron, all that kind of stuff. The clay that we have in the eastern Tidewater area tends to be very, very smooth, very, very clean, with maybe a little more sand in it, but we don't have these little rocks. This is not something I would find comfortable to step on with my feet, because in order to get the clay out of the ground into a consistency to allow you to mold and shape it, involves adding lots and lots of water and then lots and lots of labor to turn the clay, either turning it with shovels, hose, mixing it up, breaking it up, or as we demonstrate in the brickyard and has been commonly done for probably thousands of years, just using your bare feet, literally walking through the clay, in the mud, in the water, breaking it down, smoothing it out until you've got something that can be made into a brick. Now the problem you can run into with these rocks, especially if they're of any size, is later on in the process you're going to see cracking if the clay has a lot of these little rocks in it, potentially even breaking the whole brick. Because as the clay is drying, it's shrinking, but anything hard like that, like a big chunk of rock, is not going to want to do that. And I had found a good sample, and I won't be able to find it now, which one had the big rocks. You can see the inside of that brick there, all those inclusions, all the chunks of iron, all those little pebbles. And you also see lots of cracking in these bricks. You know, not big things, but these little sort of just fractures right on the outside. I mean, that's fine. But this is, again, something you're not really going to see that much of in tidewater clays like you do here farther inland. The main thing about clay when it comes to making bricks and whether or not it's going to be suitable for making into bricks is the sandiness, the grittiness. Clay by its nature, I remember looking this up in a geology textbook, the difference in the definition of clay and sand is just the size of the particle. It's the same source. It's the broken down rocks, minerals, and such brought farther from the west as the mountains have gotten from very, very tall to what we have now. All of that erosion that spread out and left these deposits and these sediment trails, that's what forms as the clay layers. Well, as we move farther and farther away, you get sand particles mixed in, those larger particles. If the clay is very sandy, what we term a very lean clay. By definition, anything about 55% sand and 45%, you get the idea. If you got a lot of sand, if you feel in your hand that there's more sand than clay, it's going to be very easy to mold and shape into a brick. It will break down with water very easily, it'll mix it very quickly, you'll be able to mold it and shape it and dry it. The problem will be you're never really going to be able to fire it hard enough because of the sand content to really solidify the whole brick to make it sort of lasting and impermeable to water and moisture. So that's why a lot of bricks come out a bit softer, because of that higher sand content. On the other end, you need to have some sand in it. So we have what's also known as fat clays, and those are clays with less than about 25% sand in them naturally containing. Fat clays are very hard to work with as far as making bricks. They don't allow or like to absorb a lot of water into them naturally. So they're very labor intensive as far as the mixing process, getting that clay broken down to a consistency that will then allow you to mold and shape it. Molding the bricks, that's not a problem. When the brick then starts to go through the drying and firing, it will also shrink an incredible amount more. You tend to get a lot more of those sort of surface fractures. You tend to get a lot more, as you fire the clay, a lot more sort of twisting and warping to the brick. It'll make a very hard brick, but it's a very hard clay to work with, and you're not always going to get the best product out of it. So ideally, yeah, you're looking for a clay that's about 25 to say 55% sand. That's going to be your best clay for making into bricks. Is that something that, you know, somebody in the 1700s is going to worry about? Probably to a slight degree. You know, you want to make sure you've got the best clay available for making into bricks, but also at the same time remember that you're limited as far as transportation. So if you're going to make the bricks for this house right here, you're going to have to use something that's right here, that's close, that doesn't have to be hauled and carted and made into bricks. This is my first trip to Salubria. It's the first time I've ever seen the house. But it compares itself in size to like the Whitehead house in Colonial Williamsburg, a house that we estimate, ballpark, is about 250,000 bricks. So I'd say there's probably roughly 250,000 bricks going into this, somewhere 220. Bricks are simple, but the scale of brick making is what can sometimes sort of overpower and impress people. So if you have to make 250,000 bricks, you don't want to move them once they're done. So you want to make the bricks right here on site, so you're limited to whatever resources you have here available. So that's why earlier I went down into the pasture, because that was probably very simply the source of the clay that was used historically. So clay is fairly important. You can see the difference. This is clay I brought in from Williamsburg, so this is the difference just color-wise between the two, if I can keep them from getting mixed in. Color really doesn't seem to play a factor in the finished product. A lot of folks think you need red clay to make red bricks and brown clay to make brown bricks. Well, you certainly do use red clay to make red bricks, but you can also use brown clay, orange clay, yellow clay. It all makes red bricks. And I don't care what those folks in Georgia say. They think they've got the corner marketed on red clay. Yeah, we hear that a lot in the brickyard. This is some of that clay from Sussex County, as I mentioned, where I was from originally. It tends to be a very orange clay. This has got a little more sand in it. It makes a very nice red brick, just like everything else. So clay is pretty simple. It's just what you have in the ground. Now, brick making is not a trade that can continue year-round. It was typically done seasonally. You're pretty much at this point in the year about as late as you're going to be making bricks, weather-wise. By the end of October, generally we've had our first frost, so that's pretty much it. Once you've got the potential for freezing weather, it really sort of puts an end to the production end of brick making, and then you start focusing on next year. So November, December, if the weather's mild enough, maybe into January, that's when you're taking the clay out of the earth and then piling it up and heaping it and allowing it to weather, freeze, thaw, break apart, allow that cycle to sort of break the clay down to a much more manageable consistency. It was also felt that allowing the clay to weather over the winter would allow the clay to be washed, to get some of the salts out of the earth, to allow that water to sort of seep through it and cleanse it. I don't know if there's any truth to the cleansing part, but it certainly does help as far as working with freshly dug clay versus something that's weathered for a while. It was also mentioned that you should turn the clay at least once over the winter months. So by, say, the beginning of February, your laborers are going to go back out and take those piles of clay and just kind of turn them over so the clay that's been in the bottom has a chance to go through that same sort of weathering and freezing and thawing cycle.
How big are the piles?
How big are the piles? Depends how many bricks you want to make.
So
You can, yeah, I mean, however high you can do it. From Jefferson's writings at Monticello, and Jefferson wrote a lot of stuff down, and we're very glad he did, especially about bricks. In his calculation, an acre of clay dug 1 foot deep, so you've already removed what topsoil you have, and you're into the clay layer. 1 foot, an acre wide, should yield 1 million bricks. Now, that's not a theory we've ever tested at Colonial Waynesburg, and I have no plans on testing that theory, but by his calculations, that seemed to be a good amount. Brickyards, we don't like to dig deep at this time. You don't want to dig, the farther down you go, the farther up you got to lift the clay and get it out of the hole. And as you get farther down, you might also get into different layers, different formations of clay that might not be the same as what you're working with up top. So what we do find is brickyards tend to dig wide and shallow. And in some cases, part of the agreement of the brick making was sort of going back and filling in the hole. In some cases, it's just kind of left open. It could be incorporated into the landscaping if it's going to be a really big hole. So yeah, it could be turned into sort of ponds or sunken gardens or whatever you want. So yes, sir.
Could the source of the clay for Salubria been part of this terracing effect that is done on the landscape?
It certainly could have. You're going to be removing and moving a lot of earth around. So that could be one source of the clay. Is there a cellar in the house? So that could be potentially another source of some of the clay that was used. So yeah, as you're moving this earth around, you're digging the material already that you need. So everything you need for making bricks is right here. Now the second thing you need for making bricks is sand. Sand is a fairly minor ingredient. Sand is essentially something that's used simply to coat the molds and the clay to keep everything from sticking together. So it's not, in most cases, an ingredient added into the brick itself. Though if you are working with a fat clay, you can sort of bolster it by adding a sand content to it, but that's extra labor. But if that's what you've got, that's a way to make those fatter clays kind of work a little better by adding some sand to it. The third thing you're going to need is labor. And most of the brick making that's done either in England, but here in Virginia, it's typically done by the lowest class of labor available to a society. So here in Virginia, primarily looking at slave labor. In England, it's going to be poor families. And here in Virginia, it's poor families also that seem to be sort of they're given slaves in order to sort of bulk up their workforce to get bricks made. So if bricks are being made on site, as they would have been here, the brick maker would have been contracted. This is a professional. This is somebody's job, though it's considered kind of a lower sort kind of job. That brick maker then arrives on site, potentially even with a family in tow, a wife, children. And then the property owner would supplement them with a few slaves. The key there is that in most cases the brickmaker is not bringing a slave workforce with them, but they're being given slaves or loaned slaves to work, which is a negotiation and is a way for the customer to bring the price of the bricks down when it comes down to it. So a lot of times slaves are making bricks on property, and they are the slaves that are on that property already, working under the oversight or the supervision of the brickmaker, who's the one who's been brought in. The brickmaker's primary role is making sure the clay is right, that they're working with the right clay that they need, to make sure production is on schedule, to make sure whatever needs to be taken care of is taken care of, to negotiate all the contracts, the money end of it. But the real skill of making bricks comes later on in the process when you're firing the bricks. So not knowing much about the family situation here as far as the labor force available, but in most cases you're looking at mostly slave. It tends to be a very small operation, 4 or 5 people, 6 people at the most. But it's men and women and children. Again, Jefferson's writings about brickmaking, it says brickmaking could be done by 3 men and a boy. 4 people together, adults and children, and he expected them to produce at least 2,000 bricks every day. I think, in my professional opinion, that's a bit much, but we've never seen anybody expect less than 1,000. So you're probably looking at 1,000 to 1,500 bricks you know, on a regular basis every day in the heat of the summer being put out by this crew of 4, 5, maybe 6 people. On a larger scale project, you might throw a few more laborers into the mix, maybe get that production up a little bit. But most brick making is done on small scale, small crews, men, women, children laboring side by side without really a lot of skill involved in it. To show you how unskilled it is, I would like to demonstrate how quickly you can mold 2 bricks and just sort of the simple operation that goes into it. The problem is going to be it's very messy, but that's all right. So put that back up here. That's the fun part. So this is a brick mold. This is a brick mold this is a big brick. Okay, this is a bigger brick mold than most brick molds would have been as far as the size of the brick. This is a brick mold that I brought that's used to make that size brick right there. So this is a big brick. It's made extra big because this is a brick specifically made for cutting and rubbing and shaping. So it's much larger than you're going to see here in the house, but it did come out of that mold. So when you're looking at brick sizing, you've also got to take into account the amount of shrinkage that the clay will go through. Most of the shrinkage is simply because of the water that's coming out of the clay as it dries and as it's fired. A little bit of the shrinkage will occur during the firing process when you get the clay up to that heat that you like, and the clay sort of what's called vitrifies or kind of condenses. And so if you want to make a brick a certain size, you've got to know a little bit about the clay and how it's going to shrink, and to make the molds, you know, that much percentage bigger than the finished brick is going to be. Brick molds are generally 2 at a time or 1 at a time. At this period, I have no evidence. I've never seen any descriptions or documentation or anything of more than 2 bricks at a time. Though to be perfectly honest, I've only seen 2 original 18th century brick molds. But I've seen lots of drawings and lots of descriptions. The 2 original brick molds that I saw were in a house known as Bremo. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. It's still owned by the family there. And a coworker of mine and I were looking for Bremo, having no idea what Bremo was. In fact, I just thought it was a ruin out in the middle of a field. And we kind of have a history of looking for ruins. And wow, they still live there. It's a nice house, but they still live there. And so we showed up, and a fellow, I can't remember his name, but we explained why we were there and what we were looking for, and he said, that's fine. And he took us around the outside of the house, and then he took us into the basement of the house, where he brought out 2 of the brick molds that were used to make the bricks to build Bremo. So those are the only 2 original brick molds I've ever seen. But this is a fairly disposable thing. You know, brick making, lower sort kind of work, very simple done. This is something that's going to be knocked together, used, and then probably burned up in the kiln when it's all said and done. Very simple construction and joinery that goes into this. It does have a metal top here, and that's simply to protect the wood as you fill it and scrape it and fill it and scrape it over and over and over again. This mold would be described as well shod with iron. For brick molds that do not have the iron shoeing, I'm not making this up, they're called barefoot molds. There was an early 17th century reference to barefoot molds that didn't have that ironwork on it. So 1 or 2 at a time, and the reason we're seeing 1 or 2 bricks at a time is because, as Jefferson explained, 3 men and a boy. And we know historically the boy, the child, would have had the job of setting these molds out to the drying field, setting the bricks out to dry, and bringing the mold to have it filled up again. So you don't want something that's going to be overly burdensome. You want to make sure you get at least a couple of months of work out of that 10-year-old or 12-year-old before you want to see them drop dead. This mold has a bottom on it. This isn't something necessarily common in the 1770s. We've seen them with and without. The bottom makes it easier as far as carrying and hauling, but you could simply do this without the bottom on it. It's going to reduce the weight of the mold, which is one advantage of it. But if you have very large bricks, it helps to have a bottom on it just to keep the brick from falling out of the mold when you use it. So, different shaped bricks, different shaped molds. That's all I got to say about different shaped bricks. Just a little aside, maybe somebody here can answer this. I've worked in the brickyard long enough to think I've heard every question about bricks that you could possibly come up with. Until this summer, when I was asked, why are bricks rectangles? Why aren't they triangles? Aren't triangles stronger than rectangles? And I had no answer for them. So you have to ask somebody 10,000 years ago why they made rectangles instead of triangles. Like I said, I thought I'd heard it all. So the sand is used. This is local sand. So again, you can get any of this here locally. I guess I'll just use the Salubria clay. One thing about brick making, I don't think a brickyard is judged by the quality of their finished brick, in so much as they are judged by the quantity that they can put out. If Jefferson is expecting 2,000 bricks a day, he is not expecting 2,000 beautiful bricks to be made every day. He just needs 2,000 of them made. If you think about it, even by accident, even if you're not trying, you're going to make some pretty bricks. It's just going to happen. Or at least have at least one side of one brick look nice. Because in truth, that's all you're ever going to see. So a lot of speed goes into brick making, not necessarily a lot of care in the finished quality, but everything's judged by speed. These are beautiful bricks if you look at the bricks in the whole house. But if you look at the bricks individually, kind of all over the place. That's that speed factor. So I just want to coat this with some sand. I just want to make it so it doesn't stick to anything. And then you just drop it and throw it. Wow, I'm really shallow. I'm out of practice on that size. That's right, scoop it out, put some more in. It's that easy. That's how much clay it took to make one brick. Here's this bucket here. And I did not plan, by the way, to bring a colonial bucket full of colonial clay. It was literally the only bucket I could find in the brickyard when I wanted to put some clay in it. So, but it works. This is much stickier clay, much smoother clay. Doesn't have that extra grit, that extra rock and pebble and such. This is a little more leaning towards a fatter clay. So it's a little bit more to work with as far as getting the consistency that you like. That was a little bit better. Still kind of shallow. And then the top will simply be struck off, maybe using a stick or a tool of some sort. It doesn't have to be pretty. Anybody want to feel why you only make 2 bricks at a time? There you go. If you blink, you miss it. So molding is pretty simple. Molding bricks is just fast. You have one person molding bricks. As long as you have somebody making sure that person always has clay, they're going to mold bricks steady, 100 bricks an hour. Or if you fill up 60 of these, one mold every minute, 120 bricks an hour, 10 to 12 hours, you're looking at about 1,200 to 1,500 bricks a day. It can be done. It's a steady rhythm. Molding is fairly simple. Now from this stage, they would have normally been set out on the ground. Maybe you've raked the dirt nice and smooth. Perhaps you put some sand down to set the bricks on top of. And that's where it's going to sit for the next couple of days. It's drying. It needs to get as much of the water out as possible until you can handle the brick. Until you can pick it up with your bare hands, put it on a wheelbarrow, move it to a stacked storage area that's going to keep the brick dry and allow it to continue to dry for the next few weeks or the next few months until you're ready to cook it.